Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome at this 7th edition of TKI Wind op Zee Live. My name is Sophie van Hoytema and happy to be your host for the next hour. Last edition in September, we were live from the field lab Zephyrus, and we talked about maintenance. And today we are back in the studio, and with me again is Bob Meijer, director of TKI Wind op Zee. Welcome, Bob. Hi. So, what are we going to do today?
Well, today we're going to talk about how to build a circular wind farm.
So we're talking about circularity. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, circularity is a very big subject, I would say. If you look at our innovation program, we cover many aspects like material use, but also decommissioning, and even the CO2 footprint of our wind farms. But for this webinar, we mainly focus on the material use and components and their circularity. And in my mind, it's always helpful to look at the circularity ladder that is also published by the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. And it starts with refuse. So can we limit the amount of material that we use? And of course, then the next stages are that you have to rethink your design for circularity. Try to refurbish or remanufacture broken components. But eventually you come into a situation where there is waste after decommissioning. And we have to look at how to recycle those materials and recover valuable materials from that waste. And so it's a very wide range of subjects. But there's more to it. If you look at material use is one thing, but we also want to discuss today is where these materials come from and under what circumstances they are won. I think that's also a very relevant subject when it comes to circularity and sustainability.
Okay, so thank you, Bob. Exciting subject, and I can imagine that you might have some questions today for our guest. And if you do, please ask them via the chat. We will try to answer them during this hour, and if we don't, we'll definitely come back to you with the answers later. So now let's start with an overview of the state of circularity in the offshore wind sector. Well, it's also an interactive session today, and we have some poll questions for you. We will be using a Mentimeter to ask you, our audience, how you think about certain topics. So on your screen right now, you see the instruction on how to participate. Please go to menti.com and enter the code, and the code will be 13603387. And if you do that right now, you can also scan the QR code to log into menti.com. And if you're ready for that, we'll ask you our first poll question. And the first question is, when do you think the Dutch wind industry will be fully circular? So will it be in 2030? Will it be in 2040? Or never, but we'll get close? What do you think, Bob?
Well, of course, we're ambitious in our innovation program, so I would look for a date sooner than later. But of course, if you look at the reality, there's still a lot of work to be done, and we'll be discussing that today as well. So I hope that it's really soon, but it must also be practical. So let's look at the results, if they are coming back already. See the first results coming on the screen now.
And if you're wondering what the code was, it's still on top of the screen, www.menti.com, and you use your smartphone or your tablet, you can use it and enter the code 13603387 if you do that. I think there's more people coming, but it's still...
Yeah, don't be shy. So use Mentimeter. It's very valuable also for this discussion today. But the results so far show that a lot of people think it will be never. Okay, that's of course maybe a bit disappointing in a way, but there's also some realism in this. So full circularity is really a very big ambition. And I think if we'll come close, that's already good enough maybe for that. There will always be some remainder materials that we have to that we can't reuse. So maybe there's a lot of realism in our audience in that way. But they're also ambitious people. Yeah, I think that's what we're looking at now.
Yeah, so we'll ask you some more questions during this session, of course, and we'll ask you to use your smartphone or your tablet again. Now let's introduce our guest at the table. So welcome Dorothy Winters from the Port of Amsterdam. Welcome. David Molenaar of Siemens Gamesa. And Harald van der Mijle Meijer of TNO. Welcome, all of you. We're going to ask you some questions. And Harald, to start with you, at TNO, different initiatives for circularity pass your desk. What kind of circularity initiatives in the offshore wind industry do you come across?
Well, that's a good question, because first I really like to see that that the industry is so proactively at the moment for circularity, and yeah, I'd like to give 4 examples, because like Bob said, it's very broad circularity. So you have the installation and the installation. Now the Dutch industry has a lot of track record on this, and the research going on for clean shipping, routing, but also lifting technologies to lift these immense large blades in a short time. The second thing is the operational part, because if you look for a circularity, a circular economy, then the first step is to take your asset as long as possible in actively most producing. So there's a lot of projects going on for automation, robotics, drone inspections to optimize the operation maintenance. Also to work proactively, to do your maintenance based on the actual health. And use materials to protect your blades and support structures. Now the third one is end-of-life solutions, because we all talk about, of course, recycling, but there's more. End of life, you also want to reuse parts of your, now there's also project initiatives about remanufacturing, for instance. It's completely new for the offshore wind, but then you put parts in a new turbine and sell it as new parts. So that's good. And also on the other side, we have the legacy of the thermoset plastic blades. It's a big burden for somebody, for some of us, but we do a lot of work on looking for different end-of-life solutions. Mechanical, thermal-mechanical, so that. And last but not least, and I'm going to keep it in the 2 minutes, that it's, of course, design for circularity. And that may be most important, that you design to repair, design for recycling, use a modular way of building, use other materials. And we have a very good supply chain on, for instance, building, manufacturing, and I think David can tell a lot more about the blades.
Well, thank you for introducing David. Thank you, Harald. For me, David, you recently presented a recyclable wind turbine blade. Can you tell us a little bit more about this recycled blades?
Yes, I can. And I think it's lovely to discuss that, and especially when you talk about why did we develop it. And like all good things, it starts with people. There were 5 colleagues of mine in Denmark sitting around the table having a coffee, and they said to themselves, it must be possible to develop a fully recyclable blade. And so they did. And I think that's the great part of it, that it's driven by the people to make it happen. Of course, we as a company, we are committed to society, we are committed to sustainability, but it's driven by the people that would like to make it happen, even the impossible to make it happen. There's only one con: it's slightly more expensive than a normal blade, at least if you compare to the manufacturing cost. So what we have to do is we have to move as an industry from, let's say, fully focusing on the metric euros to a metric euros plus a quality or a circularity aspect. And if we do that, I think we can move ahead. And then also a slightly more expensive blade in return in the end is more cost effective or more effective to the society than a normal blade.
Let's talk about it a little bit more later on. Thank you very much, David. Dorothy, at the Port of Amsterdam and IJmuiden, they've looked at what it takes to make the offshore wind industry circular. What are the most important conclusions?
Well, some of the conclusions were already mentioned by Harald. So make the most of your product and use it as long as possible. That also means that design for longer lifetimes, having a permit that fits that, but also we have to get a little bit smarter around it. So also look at, for instance, digital twin. it will serve you throughout the maintenance of the life cycle, but also at the end of the life cycle to see what is left. In terms of ports and port areas, please look upon ports as ecosystems and clusters. And for instance, for the oil and gas sector, we just launched the Decommission Blue concept, circular decommissioning for oil and gas structures. As Harald said, hey, we have different generations. Bob mentioned it as well. Sometimes you cannot reuse, but you have to process them. And together with the Port of Amsterdam and Meijer offshore ports, we are looking into designing an offshore circular wind hub, specifically for offshore wind. But some people seem to think that you need greenfield for that. But we look at our port area, we have offshore, we have maritime, we have circular companies that are used to working and processing with different materials, and put them together and see what's missing in order to start a offshore recyclable or circular hub.
Yeah. Well, very interesting, Bob.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it raises also some questions, at least for me. So, for example, if you look at this circular hub, is this unique? You're the first moving in this direction. Well, I've never heard of such a hub for decommissioning a wind farm.
Usually, of course, what you see, and I think one of the examples that we see later on, is that companies take the initiative and try to fulfill that almost that part of the life cycle. And there's more ports that are working with it, because ports cater to the total life cycle of offshore wind, from the beginning till the very end. But we are trying to, combine the entrepreneurs that you need for all the phases of the process. Yeah. Rather than focusing on maybe the company that does the deinstallation will also take care of the processing. And we try to combine from the beginning all the companies that you need in order to make it safe, efficient, effective, and sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and also maybe a question for you, David. So you mentioned the recyclable blade, and it's kind of an invention from a number of people. But what are the main issues that you had to overcome? Is that the chemical process in taking the composite materials apart, or what is the main challenge there?
I think the main challenge is not technical. The main challenge is more or less how does it fit into our current system? Because we're all evaluated based on life cycle cost. And the whole chain is focused on reducing the life cycle cost. And this just adds more cost initially to the life cycle. Yeah. And I think that's the main problem we have to overcome. We have to think in a different way. If we would like to install, and based on the targets we have in Europe, especially around the North Sea, we have to install 3 turbines per day the next 28 years. And 3 turbines mean 9 rotor blades. And if you have to decommission them at the end of life, and you can only scrap them or bury them, which is not allowed, luckily in Holland, or so you have to
do something
ahead of time. What can we do with after decommissioning? Yeah. And we rather prevent it that we have to solve it in 20 years or 30 years from now. Yeah. So I think the main challenge is how to change the system to a system that also rewards being recyclable, being sustainable, instead of only focusing on life cycle.
Yeah, it should be an integral part of the whole design, and but also the whole financing of the projects, etc.
Yeah, like Dorothy mentioned about extending lifetime. If your permit is still 20 years, and you designed for 20 years lifetime, because your financing is based on that. Yeah. So if you can extend the permit, you can extend for a longer lifetime with a little less more capex or capital expenditure, with a little bit more steel, you can lengthen your lifetime by 15 years at almost no cost. Yeah. But those 50% more cost or 10% more cost will kick you out of a tender if you're
absolutely
price.
Yeah.
So we have to do it in a smart. It's a combination of, let's say, technical criteria and the social and the permitting ones.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but maybe in the future there will then also be kind of special blade recycling facilities in your port area to include that.
Absolutely, because I want to emphasize that first generation may be about processing. But the goal, if you look at a circular offshore wind hub, is regaining raw material, as we tried with fibrous, as we see also with magnets, rare earth materials, critical raw materials, as you mentioned before. If you can keep them in Europe for reuse, that would be beneficial as well.
Yeah, and Harald, you mentioned, for example, remanufacturing of components. So old components, they're kind of refurbished and made new again. That happens a lot in the automotive industry, but to implement that in offshore wind, do you need standardization of components for that? Because now I think a jaw engine of the turbine of today is quite different than from the turbine of tomorrow. Well, you know all about that, the growing size of the turbines. Do you need standardization for that?
Actually, that's a very good question, because I think you have to see it in a wider perspective. If you want to reuse, like you said, you need standardization, standard components. Maybe we don't need this upscaling in rotor size anymore. And maybe we have to limit it now and say this is the standard joint between the tower and the foundation. This is a standard joint. That's an option. You also can look for the automotive, like you said. It's called refurbished. It's mostly reuse, but remanufacturing, then you sell it the second time. It's the best way to have. Yeah, it's new, so it's the best way to have but that's quite a challenge, because it's then you have to also tell your customer that there are some second-hand new parts in your turbine. Yeah. But it's a wide perspective, so you have to need a completely new mindset of setting up a whole wind farm. Yeah.
Interesting, because in the airplane industry, refurbishment of parts and recertification of parts is quite a common practice.
Yeah. Well, if you can do it in airplanes, then you can do it everywhere, I would say.
Shall we ask another poll question?
Yeah, good idea. Yeah.
Because it's time to ask you something again at home there. Use your Mentimeter again on your phone, please, and go to www.com with the code 13603387 if you're not there yet. But if you did, you're still in, I think. The question is, which part of the wind turbines after the blades should be the next focus of becoming circular?
That's of course given the fact that now with what David presented to us, that the blades they are more or less covered. So we have a tick in the box there. Still, it has to be incorporated in the whole system and the whole life cycle planning of wind farms. So let's have a look at the outcome so far. So there's still not many people using the Menti. Maybe that's
becoming more. I think there are seven of you. So
please don't be shy. No. So and you can also raise questions or maybe send answers in the chat. Don't worry about that. Please use the chat for that as well. And looking at the results, foundations is a bit lower than nacelle. Yeah, there's a lot of material in the nacelle, from steel, copper, complex electronics. I don't know. Is that something that you
servers, climate control systems, cabling?
Yeah. And with your experience also in say other industries like oil and gas, is that something like hydraulics that you can take care of?
Yeah, of course. Of course, the situations are not always comparable. For instance, Vattenfall just decommissioned a coal-fired power plant in the port of Amsterdam. So it has been done. We have some companies also in a port that work with e-waste, and maybe now is retail. We can scale that up to.
There's a lot of electronics in the nacelle.
There's in the industrial waste area outside of offshore wind. We already have to deal with these kind of flows. So, yeah. Okay,
so the nacelle would be, I think, an interesting next step. And I think tower and infrastructure, they score very low. I see in the poll there's also some response now. Big magnets are, I think you already mentioned the use of, say, rare earth or the winning back of rare earth metals.
I think maybe it's more your area of expertise than mine, but...
Yeah, if I may chip in, I mean, if you look to the nacelle and foundations, they're mainly made of steel. So I think what we should focus on the steel part is using low carbon steel. Essentially, we are facing, of course, the climate is affected by the CO2 emissions or the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So carbon is, I think, 40% attributable to the CO2 emissions of per kilowatt hour of an offshore wind power plant. So I think focusing on the steel part, using low carbon steel, that's one part. If you look to the infrastructure, it's mainly electrical infrastructure cabling. I think that's ideal if you can, and like Harald said, if you fix the turbine dimensions, you also fix the output. You're fixing the power output and the loads and the structure. You're also fixing the electrical infrastructure. So you can keep it not only for 10 years or 15 years, but maybe for 50 years. So extending the lifetime by fixing your turbine dimensions is a very effective measure in reducing waste over there.
But we don't do it. We keep on growing the turbines.
Yeah, but to stress it, there's a big impact on fixing that part, has a big impact on the other parts. And if you can leave your electrical infrastructure for the next 50 or 100 years, if it's there, it can last very long. So you can reuse and recombine. That's also another way of thinking. And yes, about magnets as well. I mean, there's of course it's not. It's the part giving a high attention to how we can change that. And the wind turbines rely heavily on those magnets, and we have to make sure that at least when we have them now into our turbines, we must be able to recover that. Because what you don't have to mine again, you have to recover. That also means that you have to focus on how do we design it. And I recently had a discussion with one of the TU Delft professors about, do you also teach your scholars to design for circularity? Do you teach them to design not only for stiffness and strength, but also to include what is the impact of using a different kind of material? Because they need to be aware that it starts from the design. And I think that's important. Of course, we have to make sure that if we procure it, that we procure it in a way it's sustainable and safe.
Yeah, very interesting, yeah. Absolutely. And Harald, looking at, say, the answers here, what is your view on this? For example, if you look at foundations, steel is that...
No, I think, my background, I'm a material scientist, so still I think there's a lot to win. But I think if you look for a circular wind farm, it's not only recycling. It's like we said, use it as long as possible. So if a support structure, steel structure in the sea, if you compare it to an engineering structure like a dam or a harbor quay, that's designed for 50 years. And we only use it for 25 years. That's a pity. So that's why we start with standardization, then you have also a load standard, and then maybe you can use it for a second life. So that's also an option.
And also put value, as you suggested, on those decommissioning and circularity aspects.
And also another way of thinking. A lifetime extension is also mentioned. It's not mentioned by the government for the sites, but you'd like to have a sort of overview, monitoring your system, and exactly know how much lifetime is still remaining. And I think that makes a lot of profit and make it more circular.
And in other industries, it's not always common practice, but such systems are already applied.
Yes, well, as you suggested, like aviation and...
But also in a steel factory, they have installations where they know what is the life cycle, how is the behavior of the installation, what is the remainder of the life cycle. If I order a ship, a dam ship repair, I will get a database with all the components used, including the screws and bolts, and how they should endure. So these are interesting examples of other sectors that we can adapt, or maybe have to adapt into the specific offshore winds. But
good. Yeah, we have, I think, a last question for this session.
Another poll question. Go to menti.com again. Yes, and we have a question for you. And is this the government should include an obligation to circularity in their tenders? So all materials should.
That lines up a bit with your remarks, I think, about the say the system approach.
If you would like to move from a system to a new system, like we did with reducing cost, if you set the right target and you move, you know that the next year you have to be better and better. You increase or lower in cost, or increase your the obligation to include non-virgin materials. That will help. I think it's essential to have a target for 2030, 2040, 2050, and having it as a moving target, so that you have to improve year over year over year. I think that can be helpful.
But you have to put incentives first, and in the end, it's like an obligation. And first it's important that it's a level playing field. So
have fair competition.
Yeah, but of course, a level playing field, but you want to tilt the playing field towards circularity. Yeah? Exactly. So it's not towards a specific company, but towards circularity. Yeah.
Actually, my personal dream would be that we tender for a CO2 footprint life cycle cost. I think you had similar ideas or actually started it, rather than the lowest cost.
Yeah.
Because also in third and fourth party supply chain, we see strange things happening. So a wind farm owner procures his balance of plant maintenance, and he can choose from a Dutch company and a Eastern Bloc, maybe Hungarian company, and he will choose for lowest price with the Hungarian company. People driving in buses back and forth. I know the Dutch company was more expensive because they have people that are certified, well trained, because they have a strategy. They want to use them in different areas. But still, it doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
Is it?
But I think that also comes back to putting value on these circularity aspects. And once we appreciate that value also in maybe the tender systems, then it will happen. Then you start tilting that playing field.
But don't forget that also the social acceptance part is part of it. To give it, it was also a part of the incentive.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's if you show them that you have sort of,
as an industry. I think absolutely very interesting. And I want to thank also the audience for responding, despite the fact that not everybody has found the way to Menti, but I think we've got an idea of where we are.
Absolutely, and I think David and Harald and Dorothy to being our guests, because we're going to a vlog, because our vlogger Daan visited Wim Robertson of Business in Wind and asked him about their onshore second-hand wind turbine, and that's what we're going to take a look at right now.
What happens to a wind turbine when it gets old, it's done, or it has to be removed? We can't just bring it to the landfill after all. We have to recycle them to make the wind sector more circular. But how do we do it? I'm here to meet with Business in Wind, and they know everything about it. They already do it onshore and looking to expand offshore. First, I have to find Wim, because he's gonna tell me all about it. How does Business in Wind give used turbines a second life?
We do make the calculation if it's economically feasible. If it is, then we try to find a new location somewhere in the world to install it again. And otherwise we'll recycle it close to 100%.
Alright, so step by step you take it apart and then?
Yeah, we decommission, we take it down, transport it to a workshop for refurbishment in case parts are worn out. And then bring it to a new location and install it again and make it operational for another 15 or 20 years.
And for example, where do they go?
They go to Denmark, UK, Finland, Sweden, but also to Kazakhstan, Russia. So
that's everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Why did you guys start this?
Because there was a gap, and there are not that many companies doing this professional with a focus. Some do it as a next to job, but we do it professional and as a main focus, decommissioning wind turbines and put it up somewhere else in the world.
What kind of challenges do you face currently?
Turbines were installed 15, 20 years ago. In the meantime, motorways get closer, buildings are constructed, trees have been growing, and then you have limited space to take them down again. But that's a challenge we like. The other one is pollution. Turbines have been operational. You might find some grease and oil on positions where you don't expect it, and that might pollute the environment again. So that's what we all try to prevent.
What do you think the sector should do in relation to increase the circularity?
Sectors should take it into account during design stage already. And the bigger manufacturers like Vestas, Siemens, Gamesa and GE are already doing so, for the blades at least. But the other designers, for foundation, whatever, we should all look at circularity. So what can we do with the outcome in 25 years?
So what you said earlier, that instead of looking after the 20 years how you can decrease better, do it before, but with the entire project, so with the entire design.
That's correct.
Wim, thank you for the good explanation today. I learned a lot. So, for the end, I heard it's going to be your time to shine. I'm going to hand you over the camera.
Yeah, but before you leave, Don, I'm going to hand over a coaster.
All right.
You can put your coffee on, you can put your beer on.
Probably
which you prefer. It's made of composite, so it's made of old blades already. So the process started We only need to increase speed
so cool.
to recycle all.
Thanks a lot. I will put it in good use. Now for the end, it's your time to shine.
Which parties are going to help to decommission offshore wind farms? That's the message for today.
So that was a vlog of Daan and Wim, and he asked us which parties are going to help to decommission offshore wind farms. That's what we're going to think about, I think. So Bob, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's an absolutely fascinating business model that has been created. And I think the vlog clearly shows how important reuse can be. And so these components are not wasted, they're reused again in another setting. I thought it also was quite interesting to see that the onshore decommissioning of a project is potentially hampered by all the things that have been installed around it during the time. We won't see that at sea, I think, but we don't know. Multi-use of offshore wind farms is something that's talked about a lot. So if the offshore wind farms are also occupied by, for example, seaweed farming, etc., maybe that also impacts future decommissioning. We have to think about that. And also about potential risks of pollution. And of course, the question was raised: which parties play a role in this? I think it's very relevant. It may be looking at a kind of a reverse installation process, but we don't really know. There's not a lot of experience in there. This is why I think it's interesting also to have the discussion here. Yeah.
Well, thanks. We have some new guests at our table, but before I'm going to introduce them to you, please once again ask your questions via the chat, because we really like to answer them during this hour or maybe later when we have the time for that. So we've already talked about what's already happening in the industry. I've seen some good examples from onshore wind industry. Let's take a look at the future and how we can achieve circularity in the offshore wind industry. Two new guests have joined us here at the table. Nina Vielen-Kallio of ECHT.
Thank you.
Did I pronounce it right?
Yes, it was perfect.
And Sophie Kwizera of ECHT.
Yes.
Welcome, welcome. So Nina, my first question is for you. You work on a program of the Dutch government on how to achieve a circular wind farm. What kind of project is that?
Oh, I have to say it's a really cool project, because there is so many aspects that we are looking at the same time, and we are involved with basically the whole supply chain and the stakeholders. So I think that's one of the key topics when wanting to achieve something. So not looking only on the industry, but also the regulative side and all the different aspects. So what we did in the first phase, we invited all the stakeholders around the same virtual table and asked, okay, what is needed in order to achieve the circularity? And based on that, went to the second phase, where we now have 3 different hubs: the industrial and the regulative, and also the academic or the knowledge hub. And through these 3 different hubs, we also then are able to come up with the best solutions to get to the circular wind.
So that's the report. It resulted in this report, and these are the 3 topics: the policy hub, the knowledge hub, and the industry hub that are going to be addressed there.
Yeah, so that was the outcome of the first phase. So these 3 hubs were the outcomes of the first phase, and now we are at the moment on the second phase. Yeah. With these 3 hubs, and the third phase will be then to go to the demonstration projects and also do the recommendations, especially on the circular tender criteria, which was also one of the questions here at the
So it does really tie into the policies of the government.
Absolutely.
Tendering offshore
and I think it was a very good point that was also addressed here, that it's not only about the economics anymore, that we need to start include other aspects and not only the economic side.
I think the result is the report will be you can be found on the website of ECHT, doesn't it?
Yeah, the first phase report is already available, and by the end of this year we will also finish the second phase, and there will be also the second report coming out. So definitely something to keep your eye on.
Yeah, thank you. So Sophie, what does ECHT do?
a lot of work, of course. But I think, first of all, I would like to thank you for involving me, because I think I'm one of the outsiders in this wind sector, because I work for an NGO, ECHT. And worldwide, we try to advocate for a better, more sustainable world, which is also more equal. And that's also where we did quite some research on the wind energy sector. Particularly, we researched some manufacturers on wind turbines. And the aspect that we're mostly interested in is very much linked to mineral sourcing. So the reason also why I'm here is also to think along about how do we make sure that the ambitions we have for wind turbines, the minerals we need for wind turbines, do not go hand in hand with pollution, like also was said a little bit in the video, but also human rights abuses, because we are a global human rights organization where we see that worldwide mineral sourcing, so before the energy transition on its own, was already a big problem, where we see that the costs on the humans and nature were not included, that we don't want to replicate that, and we want to transition and have a transition that is just, which means that it's fair and equally distributed throughout the world. So not just even the Netherlands, but also throughout the countries where copper comes from, manganese comes from, which is very interesting and important for steel production, for example, for the wind turbines. So there we were very much involved in the conversation, trying to make sure that this mineral-intensive transition is not going to cost people more than the other mineral-intensive way of living has already done up until now. So I think that is a little bit of what we do as well.
And it's also published in a report
yes.
called Human Rights in Wind Turbine Supply Chains.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we published 2 reports. The first one was really looking at big manufacturers that are providing the Netherlands with quite some wind turbines. And what we tried to do there is see to what extent they were already aware of human rights impacts in their supply chain, and also what they did about that. Because internationally there are many guidelines and some laws even, which indicate that companies, while operating, should be transparent in their supply chain and should also show how they mitigate certain risks within their supply chains. And that's what we also try to do with the wind energy sector. And the first report basically concluded that, unfortunately, not too much were already public within the wind energy sector. And the second one, we really went into the actual public available information from 7 different manufacturers, including Siemens Gamesa. So that is also interesting that he was also at the table right now, where we really viewed whether they were publishing and communicating about the risks and the impacts of their supply chain, particularly also linked to mineral sourcing on their website or in other publicly available documents. So that's what we did research on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating, and I think very important. I see also the link. Nina told about the approach with regard to policy. We also discussed that before this session. If you look at who's responsible for that material use in a way, and we see it's a very long supply chain. So it's basically our government, it's politics that define that we have to decarbonize. So wind farms are tendered, and there are developers stepping into the game, and they are sourcing materials, components first, wind turbines or cables or foundations from companies, and there's of course a very long and deep supply chain. So who should be responsible for that material use in your view?
I think my first answer would be we're all responsible. And I think the Netherlands has also had different ways of trying to address this. So you have, for example, the sector agreement, which is there for wind or is being negotiated right now, where there are different stakeholders at the table really talking about what is happening on the ground, what are we doing for decommissioning, what is there overall in circularity. But then on the other side, you also have the NGOs like us, where we are quite harsh and also quite transparent about the realities on the ground and what we're seeing, and that even if you might have something like a sector agreement, at some point the government should be there to say, now it's enough and we need some sort of regulation, whether it's actually putting human rights standards in tendering procedures or realizing a legislation to make sure human rights are respected in all supply chains. Yeah. You see that everybody has some sort of responsibility to take in this.
Yeah. I think let's ask our audience another poll question right now.
Yeah.
So about the strongest driver behind circularity, let's ask you a question about that. And if you just tuned in, go on your smartphone or your tablet to www.menti.com and enter the code. It's on top of the page, 13603387. And then you can answer our question and let's tell us which factor you think will be the strongest driving force in our road to circularity. Is it cost reduction? Is it reducing waste materials, regulations on human rights, or scarcity of materials?
Yeah, well, we see the first answer.
Wow, yeah, first answer.
Yeah. So yeah, it's of course a different angle to the same topic. Scarcity of materials is of course. But is that also a solution? For example, if you look at say circularity, so you're looking at this in the whole chain. You may want to avoid maybe the use of some materials that are sourced in a very bad way. Is that a solution in your view as well?
I think it was 2 weeks ago. I don't remember who did this research, but then a research was published in which they had calculated whether we would be able to reach our sustainability goals. So by realizing all these renewable energy sources that we are predicting to need to be able to reach all our goals. And I think the conclusion was there is not even that much material to be able to realize all these goals. So the scarcity is definitely going to be a question. Yeah. It is already now in the European Union where we are already developing strategies on where and how can we source minerals from other places than we are currently doing. But is that the question? Do we want to find new places to source minerals, or do we rather want to invest in more circularity, reuse, looking at other ways to develop where materials are not that much needed, or other ways are used other ways instead of actually needing from the source. Yeah. But then also cost comes into play, because it is still less expensive to get materials out of the ground to be used for any sort of product right now than it is to recycle it and use it again. Yeah.
So, and Nina, at the project you're working on for the government, does this also play a role? Say the sourcing of materials and also the circumstances under which they are won?
So when the project was started, this was looked into that because it's an important topic, the whole supply chain all the way from the raw materials. But then the decision was made that because there is actors in place, especially focused on this topic, so that we don't expand the project too much, because there is so many topics at the same time, which all are important. And often there is also a bit of a mix, which is circularity and which is sustainability. And so the definitions also of these topics is a bit not always clear, but anyhow, the Social and Economic Council of the Netherlands, they just released this advisory report also last month, where I think that probably your report was one of the drivers also, because they were really looking into that what are the next steps needed. But regarding the human rights, so this was not the full focus, but we are definitely looking into the topics that have an effect on it. And one of the things is, for example, the possibility of using material passports. Because if we start looking into where does the material come from, and there is more transparency about it, what kind of materials are used in the components and in the turbines. So even if we don't yet have an effect on where they come from, but at least we know where they come from. And it has two direction effect. So the transparency, but also when the material comes to the end of life, it makes it easier for the recyclers and the next phase users to actually have a more knowledge about what are they actually dealing with.
It's a bit like having the ingredients on food packaging, that you can see what's in the nacelle or what's in the turbine or in the cable.
Yeah, because this is of course still on the recycling industry a topic that is sometimes very challenging. You see some kind of material or a component, and you don't really know what's in it.
It's very difficult to trace as well.
Yeah.
Only the companies that sources that knows where it's coming from.
So in that sense, I think that also the solutions from the digitalization side can have quite nice new options how to collaborate also between the industries.
To make it traceable.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I must say that in 2018, I think that was when your first report was launched. For me, that was a real eye-opener. I wasn't aware of that. And it also kicked off the process with the Socio-Economic Council in the Netherlands. TKI is trying to participate as a supporting organization in that covenant. Still, it's very difficult to really implement this, and I hear many times that it's an international problem, so we should not tackle it here. What's your view on that, Sophie?
Yes, it is indeed an international problem, but it doesn't mean that there is no part for the Netherlands to play, or for any company or any stakeholders within the Netherlands to do their part in there. So that's where we also see the international conversations on legislation on human rights and business. So at the Commission, they're now working on possible legislation. This is not wind specific, but it is just to have more transparency and have companies do their due diligence. So you know those conversations are already going on. But also you have different countries who have already realized their own legislation on human rights and businesses, asking companies in their countries, in their respective countries, to do their due diligence and really look at these risks within the supply chain. On EU level, we even have the EU conflict mineral regulation, which was inspired by the US. It's now only limited to a few minerals, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. But it's already something that is out there, which is not just the Netherlands, but EU-wide, where we already see that there is a possibility for us to already start. And if there is already something for 4 minerals, why not look at all the other minerals, particularly those that are interesting and very crucial for our energy transition.
Yeah. So we could also play a leading role in the Netherlands to start this.
Definitely.
And I think that's also looking at, say, the total value. We've been discussing that as well when we're talking about, for example, the recycling of blades, etc. So this is also value in our wind farms. And I think over the years we've been squeezing out all the costs in those offshore wind farms to make it happen. I think we were very successful in this, but this may be a kind of a side effect that we've overlooked in a way. And I think circularity is one of these aspects as well.
Yeah, that is definitely also what has happened also in the tendering process, that everybody is already able to provide cheap electricity.
Yeah.
So we have already reached that goal. So now we need to push the boundaries to the next level, and I think that the circularity is that, and that is in the interest of the industry and the government also, because now when we have problems on the virgin material side, then it's even more important that we are very effective with our recycling process in order to extract the valuables back, so that we don't need to go always back to the resource.
But can we also turn it around and say that circularity is also an option to reduce cost as well? So, for example, and having the attention for, say, the sources where the materials come from, etc., but still by limiting, for example, material use or selecting other materials, innovation. We're an innovation organization, so maybe we can innovate away some of these problems.
There is so many ways how you can tackle the increasing of circularity. So just what you mentioned, that it can be either using other materials, and that is also what is happening. It can be new recycling methods. It can be so many different ways that it can be increased. And it's now a little bit of challenge also that which one is the best, or do we even need to have the best? Because I don't think that there is one silver bullet that fixes it all. So we need to have also room, also in the tender process, that what is the best strategy for different partners. That do they change the materials that they are using, or do they focus more on more efficient decommissioning processes and recycling processes? So that's the challenge also, to give room for all the other options.
Yeah. Maybe also to add on your comment on whether we don't need to reduce. So thinking about the materials we need, something that also doesn't come up often enough is the pollution that goes along with this extra mining and sourcing of minerals that are needed in general, which means that in the targets we need to get, we're also in increasing material use, also polluting a little bit more, and then we'll develop the solution for that pollution with the minerals we just sourced. So there, it's also a conversation to be had, and something that needs to be top of mind while you're thinking about, okay, why would it be important for us to reduce the material use that we are currently moving towards, basically, instead of just thinking, oh, there could be scarcity, so let's think about circularity. No, there's also that environmental aspect, which is having another impact on us, which we're trying to solve. But if our solution is not
more important drivers for the same solution. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was wondering, maybe slightly change of topic, but for example, if you look at CO2, so that's maybe less of a topic for the material use, but for a circular wind farm, is that also included in your project, CO2?
This is one of the interesting topics. What I said also about the definition: are we talking about circularity of materials, or are we talking about sustainability? Because I think that CO2 reduction that falls under the sustainability topic and not necessarily on the material circularity. Doesn't mean that it's not an important topic. It's that's how we are measuring at the moment, and that is one of our main targets, the reduction of CO2. So, but then we really need to also define that how do we measure things? What are we actually measuring? So the CO2 has been also introduced as one of the possibility as part of the tender process, or the circular tender process. And it then really, we need to think that what is the best driver? Is that the best driver or not? And I think that also, for example, TNO has a really valuable information on the LCA side on this topic. So it really requires a collaboration of all the stakeholders in order to make sure that we don't come up with new targets that don't actually make sense. So we need to think very clearly and carefully. And then the best measuring method.
When can we expect, say, the next phase? Your previous report, the link is in the chat. When can we expect the next publication from your side, from your?
If I remember correctly, we have deadline at the end of this year. So that's.
Okay.
Scarily soon. We are already in November, so that's when we are working.
So we're looking forward to that. We've also put the links to the ECHT reports, both the 2018 and 19 update in the chat. Any last remarks from your side, Sophie? Any advice for us or?
Yes, I think what is also a big conversation is the cost. I heard a few people also mention it before. Which costs are we talking about? Is it just the monetary, or are we also looking at the human and nature costs? So for me, the circularity conversation and sustainability are very much interlinked, because it's not one or the other. It's all on this planet. We're all living and making things, hopefully for a future that will benefit us all. So I think that is my last point to be made.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you very much, Nina, for adding here to our conversation about circularity. Thank you so much. I think, Bob, we're almost at the end of the session, so let's wrap things up. Well, we've had some interesting conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's almost impossible to wrap that up and to summarize that. I think we've seen some very important messages about sustainability and the sources of our materials and the human rights aspects of that. But also, I think the larger scope of circularity, and we've seen that in this conversation, but also in the previous one. And I think it's it requires still a lot of work. That's also what comes across to me. But it also must be, say, supported by a system-wide view, a more holistic view in terms of how we deal with, say, our energy transition as a whole. But if we focus on offshore wind, also a more holistic view on that. So that includes the whole supply chain, but it also includes policy. It includes the materials side, but also the value that's in there. So it's not just about cost, and we've seen their statements a couple of times. If it would be only about cost, then I think we're pushing on the wrong side of that playing field. And we should really tilt it towards the sustainability and circularity side. So that's what I take away from our discussion. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that summarization. Do you have to talk a little bit for the future right now? Do you have some other subjects or topics you want to share? What are we going to do in the near future? Yeah, so for the near future, well, we're coming back with our webinar series next year. So we'll, if you follow our news, you'll see that in our newsletters and on our website and on our LinkedIn. So that's one thing, but there's also more in the immediate future, some things I'd like to share, for example, about the Offshore Wind Innovators Challenge that we're launching. So a big company will launch one of their problems and startups can respond to that. Startups or SMEs or basically anybody can respond to those challenges. And so we're happy to launch that. I think it's next week that we're going to do that. So follow us on LinkedIn and on our website. We also have something that is a bit off topic, that is the call for floating solar. This is also an important element in our innovation program, and we see a lot of initiatives happening also in the Netherlands for building solar farms at sea. With all their own interesting supply chain aspects and circularity aspects, most likely. But we've launched a call for proposals for our PPP allowance subsidy, and that can also be found on our website. So that's for floating solar innovation projects. And in terms of events, so we've got the Top Sector Energy. TKI Wind op Zee is part of the Top Sector Energy. We've got our Top Sector Energy annual event, the Working Conference, as it's called, on the 23rd of November in Nieuwegein in the Netherlands. And we look forward to also receive you here in the audience in Nieuwegein. Yeah, I think that brings us, to the end. And of course, I would like to thank all our guests for their participation. And next year, we'll continue with the TKI Wind op Zee Live. Yes, absolutely. So we're going to continue with our series of webinars. We don't have a date yet for that, but we'll communicate that over the channels I mentioned. And we also hope to continue. We have to wait what happens tonight with the press conference about COVID. But we hope to be able to have also a lot of live events again. Well, this is also TKI Wind op Zee Live, but face-to-face events, I must say, next year as well. So I have one more question for you. Were there many questions asked in the chat? Yeah, there is one last question, and that's from Frans van der Loo. Circular costs energy. Green energy is fine, but otherwise it's more CO2. Okay, so there's a kind of a warning, I think, that's been given here, that if we use a lot of energy to make things circular, that energy must also be sustainable. So otherwise we're also doing the wrong thing. And thanks for that remark. I think, Bob, that concludes the 7th edition of the TKI Wind op Zee Live. And if there were many more questions, we'll make sure that we'll answer them a little bit later. So please let us know your appreciation of this edition via the poll on menti.com right now, www.menti.com. You can tell us your appreciation. I want to thank all of our guests in the studio here today, David, Dorothy, Harald, Nina and Sophie. And thank you, Bob, for doing this again.
Thank you, Sophie.
I want to thank all of you at home for watching live here and online. And I hope to see you next year when we will continue the TKI Wind op Zee Live. Thank you very much.